All right, so today we're going to dig into a really interesting conceptual framework for looking at stories. It's called the Triangle of Heroes, and it basically proposes this specific structure, a way of thinking about how different heroic roles can create a sense of balance in a story.
Okay, so let's get right into it. This diagram you see here, this is the core concept we're going to unpack. It basically posits a triangular relationship between three key figures, and it suggests that these figures represent distinct heroic archetypes. The whole idea is that it's their interaction that creates what you might call a complete, balanced narrative.
So, first things first, let's really try to get a handle on the foundational idea behind this model. What's the central premise? What's the main argument it's trying to make? And really, the core argument is this. A sense of narrative completeness doesn't just come from a single hero's journey. Instead, this framework suggests it comes from the interplay between these three core archetypes. The idea it posits is that when you have these three types present and they're interacting with each other, well, that's when a story starts to feel more whole, more resonant.
So, what are these three roles? Well, the framework lays them out pretty clearly. First, you've got the protector, who's seen as the guardian of nature and order. Then there's the nurturer, the guardian of the future. And finally, the culture bearer, who acts as a catalyst for renewal. Each one, as you can see, has a very distinct proposed function in the narrative.
Okay, so now that we have the overview, let's break this down even further. We're going to look at each of these archetypal roles one by one to really understand the specific characteristics and functions that the source material assigns to them. All right, first up, the protector. This archetype is really framed as a figure of stability. It's not necessarily about brute force or aggression, but more about commitment and, well, stewardship. It's about that deep sense of responsibility for guarding the natural order, for protecting what's essential to that society or world.
Now, here's where the framework introduces a really interesting, and I should stress, analogical link. It connects the protector's typical traits, dependability, conscientiousness, caution, to what's known in psychology as a cluster C personality profile. Now, it's really crucial to understand that this is being presented as an analogy to help define the archetype's function. It is absolutely not a clinical diagnosis.
And to give you a classic example, the source points to someone like Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings. You can see how he fits this mold, right? His whole journey isn't about seeking power for himself. It's about accepting the massive responsibility of protecting Middle-earth. He really embodies that sense of dedicated and even reluctant stewardship.
Okay, so moving on to the second point of our triangle, we have the nurturer. As the name suggests, this archetype is all about resilience and compassion. The focus here is on a fierce commitment to making sure that life can continue to grow and evolve.
And just like with the protector, the framework proposes another analogical link, this time to cluster A personality traits. Now again, this isn't a diagnosis. The model is just using this as a lens. It hones in on traits like responsibility and assertiveness to suggest a kind of goal-focused empathy. It's about someone who doesn't just feel compassion, but actively and assertively works to make sure growth happens. The example given for this one is pretty powerful. Ellen Ripley in Aliens. Think about it. She steps into this almost motherly role to protect the character Newt. Her defense of that child isn't about heroism or glory. It's framed as this deeply primal, empathetic instinct to protect innocence and secure the future.
And that brings us to the third and final point of the triangle, the culture bearer. This hero represents youth, curiosity, and transformation. They're often the ones who challenge the established order. You can think of them as the catalyst, the spark that brings renewal and keeps the world of the story from getting stuck.
And to complete the picture, the model suggests an analogy here with cluster B personality types. It links traits like spontaneity, creativity, and impulsiveness to this cluster. So from the perspective of this framework, this character might seem disruptive or impulsive, but that disruption is seen as an absolutely necessary ingredient for transformation and renewal. And the quintessential example offered here is Luke Skywalker. It's a perfect fit, isn't it? He's the curious kid from a backwater planet whose journey completely rejuvenates a stagnant galactic order. He literally breathes new life into everything. Okay, so we've defined the three individual archetypes. Now, let's talk about how they interact. This is really where the whole triangle concept comes to life, exploring that dynamic interplay between them. Because the framework posits that a story feels most complete, most whole, when all three of these archetypes are present and, crucially, interacting. It's not enough for them to just exist in the same story. It's the push and pull, the tension, and the balance between them that really drives the narrative forward.
Let's look at a concrete example the source provides: Beauty and the Beast. It breaks it down like this. The Beast is the protector, right? He's guarding his castle, he's cautious, tied to this kind of natural, isolated cycle. Belle, of course, is the nurturer. She brings empathy, she nurtures connection and growth. But what's really fascinating is how it frames Gaston. He's cast as the culture bearer. Even though he's the antagonist, his bold and, you could say, disruptive actions are what challenge the Beast's isolation and force the whole narrative to change. And we see a similar pattern applied to Pinocchio. You have Geppetto as the protector, representing the stable, cautious world. The blue fairy then acts as the nurturer, providing that assertive guidance for growth. And Pinocchio himself? He's the quintessential culture bearer, curious, impulsive, and his journey is what brings renewal to Geppetto's world.
So this brings us to the big picture. What's the main takeaway here? How should we think about this framework? Is it a rulebook for writing stories? Well, not exactly.
And this is probably the most important point to understand. This model isn't being presented as some kind of hard and fast rule. It's offered as one possible interpretive lens for analyzing narrative structure. Think of it as one tool in a toolbox, a way of looking at a story to see how it works. The ultimate suggestion here is that by incorporating all three of these archetypes, stories can achieve a kind of harmony. A harmony that, as the quote says, speaks to the entirety of the human experience, that constant push and pull between order, growth, and renewal. So that leaves us with a final question to chew on. Where else might this framework apply? And maybe even more importantly, what are its potential limitations? Think about a story you love. Does it fit this triangle? And if it doesn't, what does that tell you? What happens when a story is missing one of these pieces? It's a really interesting way to think about the stories we tell.